Thank you, Chairman Corker and Ranking Member Cardin, for holding this hearing, and I'd like to thank our witnesses today. Before I go on at any length, let me just briefly make sure I've understood the point you're making, Mr. Countryman. Isn't it correct that the UN experts' report on the ballistic missile launches by Iran is just a few days old?
Correct.
And in your testimony, you said that we will continue to call on the Security Council to address this matter, shine a spotlight on destabilizing activities, and increase the cost to Iran of its behavior. I respect that you are actively considering action, but could you just say, will you act?
It is certainly my intent. The bureaucratic process is complicated, in part because we want to get the facts right and we want to get the right target. But it is certainly the mandate of my Bureau to push for such action, and I think that we'll continue to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Countryman. I think the focus that all of us as members of the Foreign Relations Committee have on this issue is important because at a time when our country, our constituents are focused on other things, whether it's ISIS or terrorism or refugees or concerns about our economy, it is the challenge and the job and the responsibility of this committee in partnership with you, in partnership with the administration, to insist on a relentless implementation and enforcement of the JCPOA and the continued and aggressive enforcement of the sanctions against other inappropriate, illicit activities by Iran, whether it's support for terrorism, human rights violations, or their ballistic missile program. And my willingness to support the JCPOA was rooted in a clear-eyed commitment to holding this administration and the next accountable for active enforcement of the JCPOA, and frankly was rooted in a deep suspicion of Iran's intentions, suspicions which I think have been amply confirmed by the IAEA PMD report and by these two ballistic missile tests. So while I do commend the administration for its active outreach to Congress, and for a recent successful high-seas interdiction of a weapons shipment from Iran to support the Houthi rebels, I think we need to continue to work together, because if we take our eye off this ball, if we fail in any way to relentlessly enforce what we've got in terms of both U.S. unilateral and multilateral abilities to constrain Iran's actions, they will take that as a clear signal that we've taken our eye off the ball, and that they have carte blanche to continue their actions that are antithetical to our values and our interests. So let me first, if I could, because we were talking about what authorities you have, both unilaterally and multilaterally. In January, many members of Congress will call for the swift renewal of the Iran Sanctions Act, which expires at the end of 2016. What is the administration's opinion on the renewal of the Iran Sanctions Act? And do you believe Iran would consider that the United States would be breaking our commitments under the nuclear deal if it's extended? I suspect Ambassador Moll would like to take that.
Certainly, I'd be happy to, Senator Coons. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier in my testimony, the administration, thanks as a result from work with this committee and other parts of the Congress over the past decade and more, have developed an incredibly powerful toolkit for imposing sanctions on behavior by Iran that threatens our critical interests. The Iran Sanctions Act has, of course, been a very important part of that. It is in full force through the end of 2016. The administration looks forward to working with this committee in considering, as we get close to the expiration of that authority, whether it makes sense to continue. But it is in place for the next year. We have a good, solid toolkit to use in protecting our interests with Iran.
And do you believe Iran credibly would argue that we had somehow violated the JCPOA if we extend it? Given these recent actions, I think we will have more reason than ever to try to constrain their actions.
It's difficult for me to predict how Iran would respond. I do underscore that as we exercise our sanctions authority, we do so to protect our interests, not to anticipate or overcome any anticipated reactions.
Well, I think tireless work with our P5+1 partners as well as continuing to enforce what sanctions authorities we have and extend them as a key piece of this. I mentioned the interdiction on the high seas of a ship loaded with weapons being sent in violation of international standards. I think we have to continue and increase our interdiction both of weapons flows and capital flows going to terrorist proxies in the region. Tell me something about the administration's plans to heighten the pace of interdictions in the coming months, and whether you're successfully working with our regional partners to prepare for this.
Well, of course, interdictions can refer both to critical technology for nuclear or ballistic missile programs. It can also refer to the transfer of conventional arms covertly, which Iran is heavily involved in, and unfortunately a number of other states and actors in the Middle East region are involved in. Interdiction depends crucially upon intelligence. It depends also upon building a framework of confidence with partners in the region. And I think that we have successfully developed such a partnership with key countries in the region. I would be not only willing but downright proud in a closed session to tell you some of the successes that we've had working with friends in the region. It's been our business for over 20 years to make the Iranian program more expensive, less successful, and we've done that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Countryman, and I would welcome that briefing as well. My concern, having been briefed in a classified session about a number of successful interdictions, my concern is that other colleagues and the general public aren't as aware of it. A metaphor I've used before is that when a sheriff conducts a successful drug bust, you put all the drugs and guns and money out on a table so that the rest of the community interested in conducting illegal activity recognize that there are costs and there's consequences. And I think we need to be doing some of that at a bigger and more visible way. Let me ask you one last question. Given what I understand to be the actions by China and Russia in blocking the UN Security Council from condemning the ballistic missile tests, are you concerned that we do not have reliable partners in the snapback of sanctions when or if there is credible evidence of Iranian cheating on the JCPOA?
Senator Coons, we worked very hard. My colleagues who negotiated this deal worked very hard throughout the negotiation to make sure that there would be absolutely no stricture on the ability of the United States to impose, to fully use the sanctions tools at its disposal to respond to Iranian violations of UN Security Council resolutions, of challenges to our interests. In terms of broader international sanctions, we've also structured a process that when there is a credible report to the Joint Commission that administers this deal of a violation, any member of the Joint Commission can bring such a complaint to the Commission. And if a limited number of members of the Joint Commission refer that to the Security Council, the presumption is that those sanctions will be snapped back. It will be impossible for any member of the Security Council to veto a recommendation to reimpose sanctions. That's the autopilot. It's the assumption of how the Security Council will handle that. And we believe that that protects our interests and our equities very well.
I understand, and I'm hopeful that that mechanism will work as intended. And I expect that we will work on a relentless and bipartisan basis to ensure that our allies understand that we intend to continue to enforce sanctions against Iran's ongoing bad behavior in the region. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.